Hi, Paul Thompson here from Spitfire Audio. Today we're going to look at 5 different aspects of programming orchestral MIDI. Now, there are some ideas in here that maybe you won't have tried yet, so hopefully this will give you a few extra things, tips and tricks that you can put to use in your own work and hopefully elevate your MIDI programming where it comes to orchestral instruments. So let's dive straight in. The very first thing we're going to look at is adding a solo to a violin section to increase definition and add a kind of emotional depth. Now, I've got an example here up first where I'm using a couple of the Spitfire solo strings instruments, the violin virtuoso and the first desk violin. And I'm using those along with the Appassionata first violins, and you'll see what the difference is as we add those in. So let's have a listen to this melody first with just the Appassionata first violins up. So sounding pretty lovely. As you can see, I'm using the modulation control and also the vibrato control to add as much musicality as I can into the performance. Expression is here, but it's just to set the expression. I do that at the beginning of every MIDI region so that wherever you start in the session, you've got the right playback volume. So what else can we add to that? Well, if we scroll up the session here, you'll see that I've got 2 different things that I've tried adding. The first one is the virtuoso legato, and the second one is the first desk legato. So I'm going to add in first just the virtuoso legato, and we'll watch that as the track goes down. Have a listen to what difference that makes. Now, I think you can hear that. Let me just mute it again and play that top part. And again with it on. So you can see that this is having already having quite a significant effect. But what I've decided to do in this case is, because I really want to hear the sound of the virtuoso, but I don't want it to sound too much like the leader is just playing out over everybody else. So I'm blending in a second solo, which is the first desk legato. It's performed in such a way that it has a slightly less soloistic feel to it. And if we add that in as well, have a listen to that first. That's incredibly useful, because what it's given us is the feeling of hearing some individual players in that section in a slightly exaggerated way, because everything that we're doing here is to exaggerate and get the next level as opposed to the kind of vanilla performance playback. Doesn't matter how beautiful the original samples are, you can always keep adding a little bit of decoration here and there and just refining and refining. The art of composing, especially composing orchestral music, is in the constant revisions and just refining the material that you've got. Just listen to those 2 violins on their own. And now back with the Appassionatas. Okay, so I think you get the idea and you can hear clearly what is being added here. Now, this is something that you can apply to many different libraries, and I'm going to show you one more example using the BBC SO Pro. So first up, let's just listen to the firsts on their own. Okay, and then using the same theory, I've added in the first leader patch and the second leader patch, and these are individually recorded patches that are part of the Pro edition of BBC Symphony Orchestra that have just the leader playing on their own. So they're not like a mic focused on the leader while everyone else is still playing. These are completely separate samples. Have a listen to how that changes the sound. And all of these are just using the basic mix, the mix 1. And you can see that there's the occasional thing like this note here where I'm putting in a little bit of portamento to get a slightly different effect. None of that's really that necessary. It's just adding in little bits and pieces here and there that just make the sound slightly different. And these things I'm playing in separately. So it's not kind of copying and pasting. It's really important that you do your play it in separately along with the section, and then do your modulation, and your vibrato controls at the same time. So you're giving another musical performance, basically, layering those up. So if we just listen to the start, I'll turn them off again, and you can hear the start with just the section. And then if we go back in with them on, so you get the idea. You can hear them kind of every so often. You'll hear a little bit of the extra vibrato. You hear that player, and it really adds an interesting depth. Obviously, we're kind of hyper focusing in on one specific section right now, and all of these little tweaks that you make are multiplied when you have a whole piece going. You can really make a huge difference to the musicality and the sound of your work by making these small tweaks to each individual part. So the second section we're going to talk about is the woodwinds, often the neglected part of the orchestral family. These are incredibly evocative and can be incredibly emotive in the same way that the solo strings are close to the kind of human voice, that level of expression. So what are the 3 things that you really need to remember when you're programming woodwind parts in your orchestral music? Well, the first thing is breathing. Orchestral players have to breathe, and that is by far the most common mistake that's made where parts are written that don't have space for breathing in. Now that leads you on to the second part, which is actually very, very helpful, which is to think in phrases and to think in kind of musical shapes. And I often find it useful to try and sing a melody first before I play it. Partly to see if it's possible, although I know players can sometimes play longer than you can sing in your natural voice, but also to give me an idea of whether what I'm writing is really musical or not. So kind of like da 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 da, something like that. Sorry about my terrible singing voice. And that gives you a nice idea of how the thing might be shaped and how long your phrase should be, whether you've got the right kind of length of notes in there as well. If you're running out of breath, then that's a kind of an indication that maybe you should have a think about whether it's definitely playable. Now that leads us on to the third thing, which I think is really important, which is to look at the range of the instrument that you're playing in and the timbre of that sound in that range, but also the projecting ability of the instrument. So when you have the flute right down the bottom here, the flute doesn't project very well at that range because it's very, very weak. It can't produce a huge amount of volume. But once you get up an octave from the lowest part, so into this kind of this section of the instrument, the flute is able to sing out a lot more in that range, and as you go higher, it becomes more powerful. So that's the other thing to remember. Are you writing in the correct area of the range? There's one exception to that, which we'll come to in a minute. But for now, let's have a look at a different example. You have three very distinct, different sounding ranges. You've got the lower range, which has a nice depth and projection. You've got this area around the I always refer to it as the neck, but because it's higher up. But that part in the middle can be quite weak, and it's quite difficult to switch across through those through the lower range into the upper range, those notes. So knowing these little facts about the instruments can be very, very useful for writing better parts. And then you have the higher range, where the instrument really is quite powerful and can sing out. So useful to think about the melody that you're writing and to see what instrument that's going to work best on, and also what range of that instrument is the appropriate range to write in. Now, I said there was going to be one exception, and that exception is when you're making a specific feature sound of an instrument and you're doing this using your production techniques. And I'll take an example of this. Might be deliberately taking a drier sound and then putting a reverb, a nice big lush reverb on it to create something unusually rich and mellifluous, if that's the right word. I'll give you an example right now. So we'll go back to the flute. Now I'm loading the flute solo from the Studio Woodwinds. I've got the close mic up. So here's what that sounds like just on its own. So a lovely sound, but quite dry. And I'm going to put on there a nice generous dollop of this Cinematic Rooms, but also a generous dollop of this Hall from Seventh Heaven. And I'm going to turn that right up and give it a very, very kind of long reverb. These aren't over the actual channel itself. These are sends, so I'm still hearing the dry sound as well. And that has this effect. And I think you can tell from that you get this kind of really beautiful sound. But the difference is, the reason it sounds different to your ear and it has a different emotional intent is because when the flute player is sat in the orchestra and you're hearing from the normal listener perspective, a lot of the sounds, the kind of microscopic sounds of the instrument being played are lost. They have kind of died away by the time the sound reaches you. But here what you're doing is you're focusing in on that sound and you're saying, well, I want to hear all the key clicks, I want to hear the breath, I want to hear the kind of spit in the instrument, all of that kind of stuff. And the timbre of the instrument, the kind of harmonic content of the sound changes when you put the microphone very close to the instrument. So it's worth remembering two things. One, gives you a really great intimate sound with a giant kind of beautiful bloom around it when you put that reverb on, which accentuates all of those little sounds. But two, you're changing the sound of the instrument. It will no longer sound, in inverted commas, real in the sense of what you'd expect it to sound like from a normal orchestral listener perspective. That's the danger of placing all your focus on that close mic of the instrument. And it's part of why, we always record the instruments with a decker tree and the outriggers and all the kind of that usual kind of room microphone setup, is because that is the kind of default sound. And then when you want to focus in and get a slightly different sound, that's when you go to the close mics. Okay, next up we're going to look at the cellos. Now what I'm doing here is I'm doubling the cellos with two different brass sections to add emotion and depth to the sound, a kind of rich, thick, beautiful kind of syrupy, chocolatey feel to the sound. So let's hear the cellos on their own first. So beautiful sound there from the BBC SO cello section. You can see again that I'm moving my controllers, my modulation and vibrato controllers, and carefully using the velocity to add in a little bit of difference to the types of transitions that are triggering. It's a really lovely part, it's a lovely sound, but what are the options for adding to it to just add a little bit of difference into there. Well, the first thing I'm going to show you is adding in the horns. I'm just using the extended legato articulation of the BBC SO horns. Let's see what that sounds like when you add that in. So I've chosen two different ranges to write in, and that's really to show you how the instrument's timbre developing throughout its range can either blend things together or separate them out slightly. And I'm not attaching any particular judgment to either of those. They're both very, very useful effects, but they're important to know. So in the lower range of the beginning of this phrase, you have very much a kind of unified sound. It does sound like it's coming from a single source, and you've got the richness of the horns just sitting nicely behind the kind of articulation and detail of the cellos. Now, when you go up to the higher range and the cello sound starts to thin out and become more vocal in a way, become a different kind of sound, then you're separating that sound from the sound of the horns, because the horns still have essentially the rounded sound, and actually when you go up in the range it sounds even stronger. Now that enables you to hear more clearly a difference between the two sounds. It's not a bad thing, but it is something that, again, all of these little things, the more you know about the instruments and how they behave in their ranges, the better your programming will be. So let's look at an alternative to that, which is to use the trombones. Again, if I go here, you can see that I'm just using the legato articulation of the tenor trombones here. And let's play that and have a listen. Now, again, it's a really lovely sound. It's a slightly different sound. The trombones, I feel, hide better in a way behind the cellos. They still add their richness and the thickness to the sound, but they don't step out as much as the horns. Now, I know that you can, both of these instruments, obviously the brass have a very wide range of dynamic, and also the ability to play in a more metallic fashion, regardless of dynamic to a certain extent. So you've got that option to, if you want them to drive outwards very, very deliberately, you can always go up into that range, or pick a slightly different, more metallic performance from the trombones or the horns. But essentially, when they're playing in this kind of slightly restrained, low emotional level, then you've got two different options there. You've got the horns, which will start to sing out a little bit when you go higher, or you've got the trombones that are a little bit better at kind of blending behind all throughout the range. Now, I thought it would be interesting to just look at two other examples of this using different parts of the string section, different instruments. So the first one is just going to be looking at the violins being doubled by a two flute section. So let's hear the violins on their own first. So a nice, bright, kind of joyful sound. Let's jump over to the flutes. And if I switch to the flute track, then you can see what we're using here. So we had the Abbey Road Orchestra Violin 1 section, and now we're going to add in Spitfire Symphonic Woodwinds Flutes A2, recorded in a different location, obviously Abbey Road and Air Studios. But you're very used to the sound of this because those two studios will commonly operate as overflow for the other during very heavy film scoring sessions. So you'll often hear films where the sound of these two rooms is blended, sometimes in one cue. So let's have a listen to that. We had the mix up, the basic mix with the Abbey Road Orchestra violins, the first violins there. And here we've just got the tree and the outriggers to give us that kind of the wide matching kind of width of Abbey Road. And here's what it sounds like with the flutes. So really interesting. Again, you can hear it's kind of filling out the sound. This is a really common doubling. It's something that we're very used to hearing. And because we're nice and high in the flute range, the flutes, even just these two flutes, have the ability to sing and kind of, you know, and make their match almost to the violin section. They're certainly able to be heard there and to contribute to the sound, not getting drowned out like they would if they were right down at the bottom of the range. So let's go to our next example, which, as you can see, uses the violas, and then I'm going to add oboes to that. But first up, let's just check out this viola section on its own. And I've switched things up a little bit. So now we're using the symphonic strings with the violas. And then what I've done here is using our kind of earlier, what do you call it? Our earlier idea of having individual soloists like we did with the two solo violins. I'm doing that again here, but I'm using two individual solo oboes. So I'm getting two slightly different performance styles, different sounds, different rooms even. So we're using the BBCSO solo oboe and then the Spitfire symphonic woodwinds. Again, I'm just using tree and outriggers and then just the kind of core mix of the oboe solo. But let's have a look at what that sounds like, blended in to those lovely violas. So it blends really well, in part because the oboe is quite a powerful instrument. It can really cut through, but it's also capable of producing a nice, mellow, beautiful sound as well. And especially when it's in this lower part of the range. So you've got the violas singing out a little bit higher in their range and the oboes here sitting nicely in their kind of richest, most mellow part of their range. Now, you might be wondering why there's a copy of Stravinsky's Firebird sat on my desk. Well, apart from the fact that everybody should have a copy of Stravinsky's Firebird, I have been looking at it because of the next part that we're going to discuss, which is creating and using orchestral hits. Now, it might be that you want to produce a nice solid accent for a particular beat in your piece, and it's just a standard part of your orchestration. We'll talk about that. But also you might be trying to brew up some stuff that you're then going to resample and use in other aspects of music production. So what do we do here? Well, there is a legendary orchestral hit called Orc Hit 2 that has been used all over the place. If you Google that on YouTube, you'll find all kinds of great reference videos to explain to you how that sound came to be. But essentially, it was the beginning of one side of the record of the Firebird, and it's the opening of the Infernal Dance section of the piece. It's a sound that you're going to recognize, so I'll play it you in a minute. But I've recreated it here using two different orchestras. So the first one, I've used the BBCSO, and the second one, I've used the Spitfire Symphony Orchestra. Now, I haven't gone through and been like really kind of, gone into microscopic detail about exactly how loud each instrument is. I've kind of just played it and made it sound characteristic of those two different sounds. But I thought you might find it interesting to see how that affects the sound of it, using these different rooms and instruments, but also how it affects the sound when you then take it and resample it. First up then, BBCSO. Okay, you probably recognise that. And then exactly the same thing, but with the Spitfire Symphony Orchestra. Now you can really, really hear the two different rooms very clearly there. I think that's really obvious. So Maida Vale is more of a kind of scoring stage sound, a beautiful room, but has a kind of tighter focus to it. And then Spitfire Symphony Orchestra, recorded in Air Lyndhurst in the beautiful hall, has much more of a tail, and certain instruments therefore take over the sound slightly. So you hear the percussion there takes over the sound a little bit more, And it's not because it's any louder, it's because those are the sounds that really excite that space, and then you hear them continuing further into the tail. With the first one, I'm using the BBC SO piano. The second one, I've used the Hans Zimmer piano to get the same, obviously recorded in Air Lyndhurst, to get that same sound. Now, if I go down to my here's one I prepared earlier kind of section, then you'll see what I've done here. So it's very, very simple to do this. I've bounced the audio down each of those two hits, and then I've simply opened up a sampler instrument. I've gone to the mapping section. I've dragged in the sample. It's auto-mapped it over the keyboard for me. And then I've just gone down to the zone area here, and I've just dragged the start where the audio actually starts. And if I play it on A, that's the original sound. I mean, I can loosen it to get more of that, or I can tighten it to get that kind of sound. But it's very interesting when you start looking at the two different things and you start playing them on the keyboard. I mean, if we look at the second hit, slightly different characteristic, but when we start messing around with it, pretty cool. And again, like I said, you can really tighten that up. So you've got, this is just one hit that I've transcribed from the Stravinsky, and then we've got it here where we can manipulate it and really mess around with it. But I was going to talk about what makes a good orchestral hit when you're trying to come up with one in the context of your piece. And the one really important piece of advice that I would offer up is that you have to work in the most powerful part of every individual instrument's range. Really, really important. I heard a piece once performed, actually it was when I was on the ASCAP workshop in 1999, and it was Emanuele Fratiani wrote his cue, and we only had an orchestra of about 45 players. And he was writing to a different piece of film than I was doing. It was like a big action sequence in Lost in Space or something like that. And he had a huge sound going from the orchestra. And when I looked at what he'd done afterwards, I could see very clearly it was about putting every part, every single instrument playing in the most powerful part of their range. You can get a huge sound from that. But the key thing for us when we're using samples is you get the most power back at you through the speakers when you use that powerful part of the range. So make sure that you know. It's always good learning as much as you can about these instruments and find out where they really punch through. You know, it's not just straightforward about the high point or the low point. And, you know, with the trombones, for example, there's this kind of weak area below the really powerful area at the bottom where the pedal notes are that are sometimes quite hard to get out. All of these different things, you know, we record them very faithfully in the libraries. So when you play the libraries, you'll hear them being played back faithfully. That's one way of learning a little bit more about the instruments. But it's important to know this stuff so that when you're orchestrating, you're getting the best sound that you possibly can out of whatever library you're using. So for the fifth section, last but not least, I want to talk about percussion, but not how you would usually use percussion, how to use it really subtly to add a little something musically to something that you're doing to give you a slightly different feel and different interpretation. Now, the first one that I'm putting up here is phrasing. So I'm using the legendary low legato here. You can see what's going on there. It's just a straightforward melody. So let's have a listen to that on its own first. So that is a nice, simple melody. But what it doesn't really have is it doesn't have a clear idea of where the beat sits or what's the target? Where are the target notes in here? So what I'm using here is the Grand Casa from Abbey Road Orchestra Low Percussion, and also the Taikos from Low Percussion as well. You can use any orchestral percussion library to do this. It helps if you have multiple beaters, because I'm using a medium or soft felt beater for this effect, because I don't want it to sound like somebody's banging a bass drum really loudly. But check out the difference now when we add the phrasing on the beat. Or off the beat. A very different musical intention, and I moved that last hit as well to give us the finality of, accenting the very last note. Now, what else can you do with percussion? Well, here I've got the Hans Zimmer strings up, and I've got the 60 violins patch, and I'm using a really lovely texture part to the sound. One of those patches with the super solpont, very, very delicate and on the edge of kind of breakup. Have a listen to this on its own. Now that is a really lovely sound, but what I wanted to do here was I wanted to add a few things that don't shout out loud about themselves, but they do add a beautiful idea of the sound stage that you're in. So I've got a couple of different things in here. I'll show you what I've put up first of all. So we've got octobands being played with the rods, and then if you look at the mic here, I'm using the ambience for the mics. Then I'm using the darbuka, again from the Abbey Road Orchestra High Percussion Library. I've got Hans playing this part, and microphone-wise, I'm using the outriggers. I'm using the more directional outriggers as well. So I'm changing the soundstage slightly, but I'm sitting all of these individual parts right back. And the final piece of the puzzle being these lovely temple blocks with the soft mallets, and here, microphone-wise, I'm using the mids, so I'm pulling them forward slightly. Now, have a listen to all of this stuff playing together, and I'll highlight these three so you can see exactly what's happening in the MIDI as they come in. You often have these moments when you're scoring to picture where you need to essentially hold stasis. You need to hold a kind of long chord or a long note or something, and you can't have too much going on because it's essential that the person is focusing, the viewer is focusing, concentrating on what they're watching on screen. But you can still add lots of interesting colour. And this is a beautiful way of both adding a nice bit of kind of interesting colour to the section, but also moving the listener around in the room, feeling the space. You've got the strings, and when the strings are on their own, you don't get such a feeling of depth. They just kind of hang there. But when you put these little touches of percussion in the background and you're careful about your mic choices, you can really give the listener that feeling of emptiness and depth and space, and that can be an incredibly useful storytelling tactic to use. Next, we're going to look at another thing that I like to do, which is taking a very simple, straightforward string note and adding a metallic accent to the start of it. So let's listen to it on its own first up. So as you can see, symphonic strings, violin ones, it's a very straightforward trem note. Nothing particularly confusing about that. I wanted to add a feeling where like, oh, something really important is happening here. And just accent that a little bit. So what I've done is I've taken here the Abbey Road Small Metals patch from the metal percussion. And this has got a really useful bunch of toys in there. But I'm using two patches. As you can see, the triangles lit up yellow there and the finger symbols lit up yellow. I've just done that by shift clicking them to get them both active. And then because of the way that this is mapped, I can just play a couple of notes slightly offset and I can get both of those instruments playing this at exactly the same time. Check out the effect that that has on this kind of feeling at the beginning of the note. So you can see it changes the whole feel of it. The importance of the note, the emotion, everything has been ramped up. Something is happening. Now, the final thing that I want to show you is, it might be an obvious thing to say, but the piano is part of the percussion section in the orchestra. And sometimes that means that you use it as an accent thing. Absolutely great. You know, do that a lot. Sometimes use it just for a chord, but sometimes it can be a decorative part of a bigger percussion section. I'm going to show you what I mean by that. So I've got a simple descending chromatic motif here in the first violins. Check this out on its own first. And then I'm going to play you, just highlight everything we've got going here. So we've got the piano first down here. So if I just show you what we've got that set to. So you can see that I've got a kind of triplety pattern going on here. And in terms of the microphones, I'm just using the straightforward mix, but I'll show you another trick on this in a second. So the effect of those two, along with our other traditional kind of orchestral sounds, you know, the celeste, what's that doing? Well, it's doing this kind of triplety thing as well. The crotales, just a single bell at the beginning, and then the glock, giving us an accent on the descending pattern. So I'll play the whole thing together. And then if we listen to the celeste and the piano together, the celeste on its own, just so you can hear what's going on. And then the piano on its own, just turn the celeste solo off. So I'm doubling here at the octave, you can see. But I could also affect the overall sound of this by pushing the piano further back out of the kind of concert position. So here it is again in the full mix. And then if we look at our options here, well, what have we got? We've got balcony, we've got the spill mics, the sides, outriggers and ambience. I'm just going to put the ambience up and we'll hear the difference now. And as you can hear, it becomes slightly less of a feature of the sound. The other percussion instruments seem to rise up a little bit more. There's lots and lots of stuff you can do there with your miking and your mic choices to position the sound relative to the other sounds in the most precise way that you want. And I should also say, really importantly, there's been a lot of questions about mics over the years, and I sometimes see people pushing up loads and loads of mics. That's not how I use them. I never use them like that. If I'm going away from the mix, then I'm looking at focusing my sound around a specific sound. That sound might be the outriggers, it might be the mid mics, it might be the decatry, and I'll possibly add one other mic to that to just kind of balance up the sound. So I might be between the close and the tree, or it might be between the outriggers and the ambience. That's a very common combination, something that I know Andy Blaney uses a lot. But I'm not chucking loads of mics up. You don't see professional mix engineers in orchestral sessions putting every possible mic up. It just doesn't work like that. The balance is often the tree and the outriggers, part of the same thing. And then when you want to feature an instrument, you might go in closer. You might say, well, I'm going to use the close mics now, or I'm going to do, you know, something different. The mid mics maybe to bring them a little bit forward. But really, you're not chucking up loads and loads of mics. That just leaves you with a bit of a mess as a sound. Always think about focusing your sound first. So pick the one mic that you want to hang it around, and then try adding another mic to it and seeing what effect that has. If you put everything up, there's literally no point. You might as well just use one of the mix mics and then save your voice count. So I hope that was useful. 5 different areas of orchestral MIDI programming and a few different ideas of combining instruments, of different ways of approaching programming to the kind of standard ways that you might already have experimented with. And hopefully that'll provide you with some interesting new ideas to take into your own pieces. Thank you very much for watching as ever. Look forward to seeing you on the next one. Bye-bye.